Randolph Scott, one of Tinseltown's most iconic leading men, lived through an era when being yourself could end your career. And now, decades later, we're finally uncovering the truth he hinted at, but never said out loud. Randolph Scott identified the gay actors from old Hollywood who had to live in secrecy. Comment 1 if you believe old Hollywood was full of untold stories. Or 0 if you think most secrets should stay buried. While old Hollywood appeared idyllic, it served as a trap for many. And now, let's dive right into the secret names that Randolph Scott had listed. Randolph Scott's shocking revelation. Image was everything during the golden age of Hollywood, and actor Randolph Scott was one of the few people who understood this more than anybody else. Scott was a towering figure in westerns and a symbol of male stoicism. He lived during a period when being publicly homosexual in Hollywood might bring about the instantaneous destruction of a career. Later in his life, Scott apparently recognized the emotional hardships of some of his closest contemporaries guys, whose jobs and public personalities frequently stood in sharp contrast to their private lives. This was a rare moment of openness on Scott's part. He mentioned 6 performers of this kind that he had known, each of whom was a giant in the profession. All of these actors were gay, but they were compelled to hide their actual selves from the public due to social mores and demands from studios. Cary Grant may have been the most well-known name on Scott's list, and he was also the one who was most closely associated with him. They lived together in a beach home in Santa Monica for more than a decade, during which time they had a notably intimate connection. This romance took place throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. Grant and Scott were frequently seen in domestic situations such as reclining poolside or sharing meals. These photographs provided a look into what many people have thought to be a love connection that was skillfully concealed under the idea of friendship. The press referred to them as bachelor housemates. There has been persistent curiosity regarding the nature of their connection for decades, although both men subsequently married women. It was a sad need at the time for Scott, who remained Grant's unwavering friend throughout his whole life, to conceal the truth about their relationship. Clift's real-life emotional torment frequently reflected his roles, and he was famed for his agonizing performances in films such as A Place in the Sun and From Here to Eternity. Montgomery Clift was another name that Scott cited. He was one of the most sensitive and emotionally raw performers in Hollywood. Clift's sexuality was a well-kept secret among those who worked in the entertainment industry, although he never publicly acknowledged his sexual orientation. Because of the demands of his job and the catastrophic automobile accident that occurred in 1956, which left him physically and emotionally damaged, he fought with an enormous inner conflict. The circumstances exacerbated this conflict. Randolph Scott, who was able to witness Clift's self-doubt and sadness, personally felt profound empathy for a guy whose genius was obscured by the fact that it was impossible for him to live freely by his disabilities. It is possible that Merv Griffin is most often recognized today as the pleasant talk show presenter and entertainment tycoon who was responsible for game programs such as Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. However, beneath the friendly public image there was a guy who was extremely secretive about his personal life. Griffin has never publicly addressed his sexuality, although there have been rumors and persistent conjecture about it for years. Scott knew another side of him that had to navigate the worlds of fame and secrecy. When Griffin was building his media empire, the risks were not only personal, but also financial and corporate. He was doing it at a time when being exposed might lead to ruin, so the stakes were tripled for him. One such actor that Scott mentioned as someone who had to conceal his actual identity was Jim Nabors, who was well known for his role as the clumsy but endearing Gomer Pyle on The Andy Griffith Show and its spin-off Gomer Pyle United States Marine Corps. Stan, Cadwallader, and Nabors were in a committed relationship for a considerable amount of time, and in 2013, just prior to Nabors' passing, the couple was finally able to tie the knot. On the other hand, Nabors had to carefully control his public image to prevent any scandals when he was at the height of his celebrity. It was a joke that severely disturbed Nabors and highlighted how poisonous and harmful Hollywood's rumor mill could be for homosexual artists. The joke was based on a recurrent urban tale that claimed that Nabors and Rock Hudson had married. Cesar Romero was known for his charisma and his bachelor lifestyle. He was frequently cast in leading parts, but he is most recognized for his portrayal as the flamboyant Joker in the Batman television series that aired in the 1960s. Romero kept up a public character as a ladies' man despite the fact that he never married. However, his homosexuality remained a well-kept secret inside the business. Scott expressed regret over the extent to which Romero had to conceal his private life from the public despite his sophistication and wit. Scott described him as a man of tremendous dignity who deserved to live and love without restriction, but a cruel culture denied him the opportunity to exercise that basic right. Among the 6 names that Scott listed, Rock Hudson was the final one. He is maybe the most terrible example of the extreme restraints that were prevalent during that time. Hudson was the quintessential example of masculinity in Hollywood throughout the 1950s. He starred in comedies and romantic dramas on the opposite side of leading ladies such as Doris Day. His agency, Henry Wilson, which specialized in preparing young male actors for success while keeping their personal lives under wraps, was responsible for meticulously managing Hudson's secret existence. In actuality, Hudson was gay, and his agent was responsible for managing his double life. When Hudson was diagnosed with AIDS in the 1980s, the truth was finally brought to light for the first time. His passing in 1985 represented a turning point not just for the entertainment industry but also for the general public as a whole. It compelled a new degree of understanding and sensitivity about LGBT identity as well as the AIDS pandemic. As someone who had witnessed Hudson's climb to popularity despite the burden of secrets, Scott was saddened by both the guy and the years that Hudson had spent concealing from the rest of the world. Cary Grant, Montgomery, Clift, Merv Griffin, Jim Nabors, Cesar Romero, and Rock Hudson are the 6 individuals whom they are referring to in this sentence. The statements that Randolph Scott made were not only a rehashing of rumor or admissions. In doing so, he was recognizing their suffering, paying tribute to their fortitude, and gently denouncing the strict cultural conventions that had prevented them from speaking up. The common thread among these famous, talented people is the quiet pain of living inauthentically. Randolph Scott. Stoic, soft-spoken, and deeply private, never made public declarations about his identity. But those closest to him say he carried the weight of what was never said. He observed the impact it had on people. He watched friends struggle with mental illness, substance abuse, and isolation, not always from the pressures of fame, but from the impossibility of being seen. In later years, when asked about the golden era of Hollywood, Scott would sometimes deflect. "It was beautiful," he once said, "but it wasn't always kind." That simple phrase, uttered with a heavy pause, said more than he could ever safely reveal. His friendship with Cary Grant remained a quiet thread throughout his life. A love story, perhaps, or a lifelong companionship that defied easy labels. A union of contrasts. Before Randolph Scott settled into the quiet, steadfast rhythm of family life with Patricia Stillman, his heart had once been tied briefly and intriguingly to one of the most storied names in American high society. In 1936, at a turning point in his early film career, Scott married Marion DuPont, a refined and formidable woman whose lineage and legacy reached back to the foundations of American industry. Marion was no ordinary heiress. As a direct descendant of Eleuthère Irénée DuPont de Nemours, the French chemist and founder of the E.I. DuPont de Nemours & Co. She had been born into privilege but shaped by discipline. Her father, William DuPont Sr., was not only a powerful industrialist, but also a man obsessed with horses, a passion he passed on to his daughter. Marion embraced that legacy with her own commanding presence in the world of equestrian sports. She was as comfortable in the stables of Virginia as Randolph was on the saddle of a film set playing cowboys under the blistering lights of the western frontier. What brought them together remains something of a mystery, perhaps a friendship forged in elite circles, perhaps a shared love of tradition, or perhaps simply curiosity. In an odd twist of fate, Scott had served as best man at Marion's first wedding to George Somerville, a Virginia horse breeder. That kind of intimate proximity over time may have grown into something deeper, but their backgrounds couldn't have been more different. He, a Southern-born actor on the rise in the unpredictable world of Hollywood. She, a poised equestrian aristocrat with generations of wealth behind her and an East Coast heritage steeped in decorum. Their marriage was dazzling on paper. Old money meets golden age cinema. But beneath the elegant exterior, the fault lines soon appeared. Marion's life was deeply rooted in the traditions and rhythms of Virginia's horse country. She had her own legacy to uphold, one not measured by box office returns but by bloodlines, pedigrees, and the thundering excitement of the racetrack. Randolph, meanwhile, was being drawn ever more deeply into the kinetic orbit of Hollywood, its film sets, contracts, and constant motion. They were perhaps two people who admired one another deeply, but who lived in two very different worlds. The marriage lasted only 3 years, quietly dissolving in 1939. There were no scandals, no headlines splashed across the tabloids. Theirs was a dignified ending, perhaps echoing the way it began, with civility, grace, and an understanding that love alone might not be enough to bridge such a vast gulf in lifestyle and ambition. Yet the story didn't quite end with the divorce. In a decision that continues to intrigue historians and fans alike, Marion chose to keep his name. For the rest of her long and illustrious life, she was known not just as Marion DuPont, but as Marion DuPont Scott. She carried that name with pride, not as a Hollywood trophy, but as a quiet acknowledgement of a chapter in her life that, however brief, had meaning. Whether it was affection, nostalgia, or simply a symbol of mutual respect, the name endured. And so did Marion's own legacy. She transformed her family estate, Montpelier, into a beacon of American horsemanship and philanthropy. A woman of formidable grace, she remained a driving force in the world of steeplechase racing, championing both horses and historic preservation until her death in 1983. For Randolph Scott, the marriage would remain a short but fascinating detour in a life otherwise marked by consistency and order. And for Marion, it was a rare interlude from her world of bridles and breeding an affair with a cowboy who was, for a moment, her partner. Two distinct legacies, one brief union, and a name that quietly bound them across the decades. A life anchored in quiet devotion. By the time Randolph Scott met Patricia Stillman, he had already lived many lives. He had survived a war, conquered the Hollywood studio system, and carved his image into the mythos of the American West. But underneath the celluloid legend was a man still searching for something lasting, something that couldn't be framed or filmed. In Patricia, he seemed to find it not a mirror of his fame, but a quiet companion who offered what all the lights and cameras never could: peace. They married in 1944 amid a world in chaos. World War II raged overseas, and Scott was at the peak of his career with box office hits under his belt and a reputation as one of Hollywood's most dependable leading men. Patricia was just 25, more than 2 decades his junior, a slender, intelligent brunette with a gentle presence and sharp mind. Though she had dabbled in acting, her ambitions lay elsewhere. She wasn't interested in becoming part of the Hollywood machine. She was interested in building a home, a life, and a partnership. And Randolph, perhaps weary of the fleeting glitter around him, found her timing perfect. Their marriage stood in stark contrast to the whirlwind romances and tabloid entanglements of their peers. There were no scandals, no public fallouts, and no drunken fights splashed across headlines. Instead, what emerged was something rare in the entertainment industry: stability. Quiet, enduring, steadfast stability. They lived not for parties or premieres, but for evenings on the veranda, Sunday breakfasts, and summers with their children. In 1950, after 6 years of marriage, they adopted 2 children, Sandra and Christopher. The reasons for adopting remained private, as was the Scots' way, but the decision was unmistakably grounded in love. For a man who had once portrayed lonely cowboys and rugged bachelors riding into the sunset, becoming a father brought him a new kind of role, one without applause but full of meaning. Their Beverly Hills home reflected their values, elegant but never ostentatious. It was a place of comfort and warmth, filled with laughter, long dinners, and books rather than bright lights. Scott became the kind of father who rarely spoke of his fame. He was more interested in teaching his children patience, respect, and the importance of keeping your word. He was from a generation where character wasn't something performed but lived. As he aged, Scott gradually stepped back from the industry that had given him so much and demanded just as much in return. By the mid-1950s, he began slowing down his workload, appearing in fewer films, choosing quality over quantity, and savoring the time he spent at home. His final film, Ride the High Country, would become a fitting swan song, a meditation on dignity, aging, and integrity that mirrored the man himself. Patricia remained by his side through it all, quietly, elegant, fiercely loyal. While others around them fell into ruinous habit scandal or career-ending excess, the Scotts weathered time with grace. Their marriage wasn't plastered across magazines, but those who knew them up close spoke of deep affection, mutual respect, and a kind of love that didn't shout but whispered. Even in his final years, when age began to etch deeper lines into his famously stoic face, Randolph was never alone. Patricia was always there, his partner, caretaker, and confidant. They had built a sanctuary together far from the Klieg lights and red carpets. It was a legacy of devotion, perhaps the most important of all. Randolph Scott died in 1987 at the age of 89. Patricia lived on until 2001, quietly preserving his memory without spectacle. In a world often drawn to noise, they had chosen silence. In an industry obsessed with reinvention, they had chosen permanence. And in a city known for breaking hearts, theirs had endured. Their love story, low profile but luminous, wasn't the one Hollywood liked to tell, but it was one worth remembering. The making of a quiet legend. Before the cowboy hat, before the saddle, before the iconic squint beneath the wide western sky, he was simply George Randolph Scott, a boy born on January 23, 1898, in the rolling hills of Orange County, Virginia. He came into a world still reverberating from the echoes of the Civil War, a world where tradition clung tightly to identity, especially in the American South. The roots were deep, the expectations deeper. The Scott family soon settled in Charlotte, North Carolina, where Randolph was raised amid the genteel rituals of Southern propriety. His father, George Grant Scott, was a certified public accountant, a meticulous man of numbers and order who believed in respectability above all. His mother, Lucille Crane Scott, a woman of strong will and delicate grace, ran the household with the quiet resolve of someone who understood the value of appearances but also the strength hidden behind them. Randolph grew up in a house of starched collars, yes ma'ams, and silent codes. But underneath the manners there was restlessness in the boy, something that would never quite settle. From an early age, Randolph embodied contradiction, athletic and cerebral, courteous, but drawn to risk, well-bred, yet increasingly curious about the world beyond drawing rooms and debutante dances. He excelled in sports, finding a kind of poetry in movement. At the Georgia Institute of Technology, and later at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, he pursued his studies with the same earnestness that marked his character. But it was in the drama department, away from the stately columns and academic lectures, that he found something that felt like home. On the stage he could both escape and reveal. It was pretend, but it was honest. Then came the war. Like many young men of his generation, Randolph Scott answered the call to serve in World War I. He became an artillery observer posted to France, an experience that carved away any lingering illusions of grandeur. He witnessed the horror, the silence between blasts, the fragility of life against steel and smoke. But he also saw camaraderie, resilience, and moments of grace amidst the mud. War didn't harden him, it quieted him. It deepened the stillness that would later define his screen presence. When he returned, he did so not with fanfare, but with a kind of sacred withdrawal. Some things couldn't be spoken about, so he didn't. The post-war years left him suspended between duty and dreams. In a country roaring into the 1920s with jazz flappers and modernity, Randolph, always deliberate, always composed, found himself drifting towards something less conventional. Hollywood. By the end of the decade, he left for Los Angeles. Not with swagger, but with hope. The kind that doesn't burn, but smolders. It was a tentative gamble, not a chase. He didn't crash onto the scene with raw ambition or charisma that demanded to be seen. Instead, he arrived as he always did in the background at first observing. Connections helped. One of his father's business acquaintances introduced him to Howard Hughes, the enigmatic millionaire whose presence in early Hollywood loomed large. Hughes saw something in Scott, not just the physicality, though Scott's 6'2" frame chiseled jaw and patrician composure made him visually unforgettable, but the internal discipline. He wasn't hungry in the way others were. He was exacting, reliable, rooted. Those first silent film roles came slowly. He was cast as the dignified extra, the steady soldier, the unspeaking presence in the back of a shot. But directors noticed something rare. Even when Randolph didn't speak, the camera stayed with him. He had that elusive quality of cinematic gravity. You believed him. You didn't need him to explain himself, you just knew who he was. Over time, those bit parts gave way to speaking roles and from there to prominence. The evolution wasn't meteoric, it was methodical, built with the same care he might have used on a well-oiled rifle or the grip of a saddle. Hollywood had plenty of stars who exploded into fame. Randolph Scott did something rarer. He earned trust. With audiences, with directors, with his peers. And beneath every role he played, whether lawman drifter or gentleman cowboy, there remained a trace of the boy from Charlotte, the artillery observer from France, the young man who preferred silence to spectacle. A man shaped not by spotlight but by restraint. And that restraint would make him legendary. Career journey. The early parts that Scott played in films such as The Far Call and The Virginian helped him establish himself in the Hollywood industry. Throughout the 1930s, he featured in a wide range of films, including romantic comedies, criminal thrillers, and adventure dramas. Beginning in the early 1930s, he began to be cast in more significant roles, and it was his appearances in films such as The Last of the Mohicans and Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm that brought him to the forefront of the acting world. The Western genre, on the other hand, was the one that turned Randolph Scott into a true superstar. By the 1940s and 1950s, he had established himself as one of the most well-known and revered Western performers in the history of the American film industry. However, it was not until the 1940s that he fully found his place in the Western genre. His restrained yet powerful personality deeply resonated with moviegoers in this genre. In the course of his illustrious career, which spanned more than 3 decades, Randolph Scott made appearances in more than 100 films, of which more than 60 were Westerns. The on-screen presence that Scott intentionally built was one that was powerful and constant in contrast to the majority of his peers. A character who preserved justice, safeguarded the innocent, and traversed the harsh frontier with calm dignity, he frequently portrayed the role of the solitary cowboy. He was a figure who was moral and resolute. 7 Men from Now, which was released in 1956. The Tall T, which was released in 1957. Ride Lonesome, which was released in 1959. And Comanche Station, which was released in 1960, were among the westerns that he worked on often with director Bud Bedicher and screenwriter Burt Kennedy throughout the 1950s. These films, which are sometimes referred to together as the renowned cycle, are today regarded as masterpieces of minimalist narrative and psychological depth, demonstrating Scott at the pinnacle of his artistic career. It was not just Randolph Scott's physical presence that made his performances so engaging. It was also his sophisticated ability to portray inner fortitude and personal integrity without resorting to extravagant gestures or unnecessary language. However, his characters were seldom one-dimensional, despite the fact that he was frequently portrayed as the morally upright hero. In many cases, these were men who had been damaged by loss and worn down by violence, but who remained unyielding in their sense of what was right and wrong. He was a favorite of both filmmakers and fans due to the fact that he possessed a blend of stoicism, vulnerability, and ethical principles. Scott's representations were reserved and contemplative, providing a more subtle and realistic image of frontier masculinity. This stands in stark contrast to other Western performers like John Wayne, whose roles were defined by their enormously bold personalities. He was also a shrewd businessman who made astute investments in oil real estate and other endeavors. As a result, he was able to spend his retirement years in luxury in the early 1960s following the release of his final picture, Ride the High Country, which was directed by Sam Peckinpah and was a classic film that served as a suitable conclusion to his career. A beautiful swan song that matched Scott's own exit from the silver screen. That picture featured Scott in a starring role opposite Joel McCrea as two elderly lawmen who were confronting the twilight of the Old West. Since the beginning of his life, Scott has maintained his status as a highly regarded person in the entertainment industry. He is known for his expertise, discipline, and modest benevolence. It appears that he did not seek an Academy Award and he did not win any of them. But he earned the lasting respect of peers and critics alike for his consistent artistry and sincerity. His contributions to American cinema, particularly in the Western genre, have left an everlasting impression, and they have influenced performers and filmmakers of several generations that came after him. Several directors, including Martin Scorsese, Clint Eastwood, and Quentin Tarantino, have credited Scott's work with playing a significant role in molding their concept of character-driven narrative and moral ambiguity in film. Randolph Scott's death. Beverly Hills, California, was the location where Randolph Scott breathed his last on March 2, 1987, when he was 89 years old. His death was ascribed to a mix of heart and lung problems which are not unusual in people of old age, particularly those who may have been exposed to smoking or the environmental conditions of previous Hollywood sets. His death was due to a combination of respiratory and cardiovascular disorders. To a great extent, Scott had withdrawn from public life during his latter years, opting instead to lead a peaceful and private life, which was a significant departure from the spotlight that he had experienced during his early decades as a Western cinema hero. Fans, colleagues, and film historians alike remembered him as a towering figure in classic American cinema, particularly within the Western genre, where he had established himself as a symbol of stoic heroism and moral integrity. His passing was noted with admiration by all of these individuals, although he led a reclusive lifestyle. After Randolph Scott passed away, his body was laid to rest in Elmwood Cemetery in Charlotte, North Carolina. This particular location was selected due to the profound personal importance it held for him. Long before Hollywood called, Scott had spent his formative years in Charlotte, which was his hometown. Charlotte was also the area where he had spent his days. He was laid to rest in that location, which served as a symbolic return to his roots and highlighted the link he kept with the South throughout his whole life. Elmwood Cemetery, which is one of the oldest and most historic burial sites in the area, is the final resting place for a number of prominent personalities. Since then, Scott's tomb has become a pilgrimage spot for fans of his films and legacy, despite the fact that it is not very significant. Scott's last days. His marriage to Scott had lasted for 43 years, making it a long and durable partnership. It was in the early 1940s that the couple first met, and they tied the knot in 1944. Their marriage was considered to be one of the most solid and private marriages in the world of Hollywood, which is known for its frequent upheaval. They chose to live a life that was oriented on family, mutual commitment, and shared values rather than participating in the celebrity party circuit. They did this in order to retain a strong feeling of solitude, which they did together. Patricia was there for Scott throughout the last period of his career and into his retirement, providing a consistent presence for him as he transitioned from being a film legend to a private man. She lived for 17 years after his departure, passing away in 2004. Patricia was laid to rest next to her husband in Elmwood Cemetery, a gesture that further cemented their eternal connection in both life and death. This was done in accordance with their lifetime tie. A remarkable mid-century modern mansion in Beverly Hills served as the couple's dwelling throughout their final years. This property represented the couple's sophisticated tastes as well as the architectural aesthetics of the post-war era. The house, which was noted for its clean lines, open floor plans, and use of natural materials, was a tangible embodiment of the couple's understated elegance. It was made of natural materials. Regrettably, the house was destroyed in 2008, despite the fact that it was historically significant and architecturally significant. When it was destroyed, not only did it mean that a notable piece of mid-century design had been lost, but it also meant that a physical link to a golden period of Hollywood and to one of the most famous personalities in the history of the industry had been lost. It is important to note that Randolph Scott's legacy encompasses far more than his physical presence and the things he owned. After his passing, the personal archives of Randolph Scott, which are generally referred to as the Randolph Scott Papers, were given to the Special Collections Department of the UCLA Library. This large collection contains a treasure mine of diverse items, including rare images, scrapbooks that have been meticulously curated, personal and professional letters, handwritten notes, published articles, and even original home blueprints from his Beverly Hills residence. The actor's development from a young man in North Carolina to one of the most recognized leading men of his period is chronicled in these documents, which provide a rare view into both the professional and private life of the actor. Not only is the collection an invaluable resource for cinema historians and researchers, but it also serves as a tribute to the careful and purposeful life that Scott led outside of the screen. Through these records that have been saved, his voice and vision continue to reverberate, offering future generations with insight into a man who, although frequently portraying the strong and quiet cowboy on screen, left behind a legacy that is abundant in depth, character, and historical relevance. Randolph Scott passed away taking many secrets to the grave. But through archives, interviews, and those who knew him, we're left with glimpses of the truth and of a man who may have been far more than what Hollywood allowed him to be. What's your take? Do you think the film industry today is more accepting, or do secrets still dominate behind the scenes? Comment below and join the conversation. If you found this story powerful, like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden lives of legends.